All right, everyone, it is now 3:30, which means it is time for us to get started. Welcome back to COM 426 Modern Web Programming. This is lecture 22. We'll give everyone a chance to settle down before we get started with announcements. Great, thank you. All right, so to get started with announcements here, first thing is great work on your prototype. Remember that the prototype submission on Gradescope is due tonight for the final project. We already got through, there were some very few projects that we had to do early, which we did today. They're already looking great. So thank you all for the entire class will do a great job. Remember that the schedule for these presentations has been posted on Canvas. And it should also be on the website, like on the actual final project document as well. So you make sure that you have your time and that you know the time and the location where we're meeting. We're going to be meeting in the CSXL hallway in Sitterson Hall. Also, one thing I would ask is to make sure, because all the presentations are 10 minutes, right? It's not like a crazy amount of time. So make sure that before it is your time, that there is at least one computer that has the document already pulled up. Preferably, the computer should have an HDMI port, so that way you can just walk in, plug in, and get started. That way you don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about getting everything loaded. All right? The other thing here, A07, the design lab, that is due on Sunday. Again, that is our last programming assignment. Already people have begun submitting it, so great work there. I will note, of course, that for the design lab, right, you still have that late policy that applies. For final projects, because we're doing the presentations tomorrow, right, make sure that you get something submitted by today. That's for all of the teams. Okay? And then finally, after that, the next part of the final project, which is going to be for our first development sprint, where you all will start to actually build your website and begin programming in the kind of repository that you all have set up. That will begin on Friday. It will be due kind of the Tuesday before break. So make sure to check what is required here, right? This is kind of a check-in. So we're looking to see that you have made very good progress on 3 out of the 5 features. And all of the details for that and how it is graded will be on, or it's already on the document. It's already on the website as well. For this, remember that the next submission that's kind of at the end of the semester, that's the one where we're going to be grading pretty much all of those. That's the 65 points of the project will be graded more for the completion of all the features, all your other requirements as well. Make sure to note that for the development sprint, right, this is going to be, we're just checking to make sure that you've made reasonable progress, and it's about 15 points. So it's mainly a check-in for us to make sure that you're on track to be able to finish by the end of the semester. Are there any questions with any of the announcements here? All right, perfect. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Katie, part of the CS Department's Career Services team, to talk about a new initiative that they're working on. Remember, because we have a guest speaker, please give your undivided attention and make sure to pay attention and be quiet while we're talking. All right. Yeah. Yep. It should be. Hello. Here, let me see if I have to turn up the. Yeah, it should be. Yeah.
Okay. I'm for the Career Services Department for Computer Science. And I'm here to talk to you today about our new program that'll be launching this spring. A little bit about the program. This is a program that was done together this semester that will officially launch next semester. And it's going to connect a mentee in computer science, either a first-year computer science student or someone earlier in their CS career, an upperclassman in computer science. The idea is that as a mentor, you'll be someone who is there as a resource for the underclassmen. There will be events with the department throughout the semester, including a kickoff event with food and speakers and alumni connections. And this is just a really great opportunity for anyone who wants to be involved as a mentor in computer science, to go on to the department and be there as a resource for underclassmen the majors. As a mentor, which is why I'm here talking to this class, I think a lot of people here would be interested in being a mentor and be really good fit for the mentor position. You would attend the Meet Your Mentor kickoff event in the beginning of the spring semester. Then you'll provide your contact information for your mentee and be there for questions and ongoing support throughout the semester. We ask that you meet just twice a semester. This can be on your own schedule. It'll be a pretty informal relationship. And then throughout the semester, there will also be optional networking and events within the department that you can attend, like study sessions and coffee chats and things like that. If you're interested, I encourage you to scan these QR codes. These will also be in the slides later, and it'll be linked when they provide them to you. So you can click on the links there and you can submit your interest. This isn't sign up to the program. This is just giving us your email so we can reach out to you with more information when we have more info about the program solidified, and we can let you know when applications open. If you have questions, my email is in the top corner. Feel free to reach out to me or anyone from the careers department, and we'll be happy to answer your question. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Katie. So again, everyone, this is a extremely great opportunity. The Career Services team has always done an incredible job with these type of things, and I think this will be a great way. Most of you are juniors and seniors, and so this will be an extremely nice way to be able to give back to the CS community and to your fellow classmates who will be going through the curriculum after you. So again, the QR codes for all of these things will be on. They're already here, so they're available on the website, and I highly recommend checking it out. All right, so the second thing here that I have a note for is there is an information session regarding study abroad opportunities for the computer science department today, I believe, 5 to 6 p.m. in Fred Brooks 141, right after class. We have 3 study abroad opportunities for the summer this year, which I believe is more than we typically ever have. We have UNC Computer Science in Copenhagen. Chris Jordan is going to be giving Comp 590, Design of Design. It's actually kind of related a little bit to the things that we've been talking about in this module. So if design is interesting to you, I highly recommend checking this out. This, I believe, if I remember correctly, is summer session kind of one time period, but I would just double check to be sure on the website. In addition, CC is going to be having 2 study abroads, one in the first half of the summer, which is Comp 380, which is Technology, Ethics, and Culture in Sweden, in Stockholm. And this is a course that is, of course, it is within our department, but it's also interdisciplinary. So people, if you know anyone who's outside of the department who might be interested, they're also welcome to apply. And then finally, very exciting for this year, this is brand new, we have computer science in Japan. I believe this is going to be in Osaka, Comp 311, computer organization. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in these, to attend the information session. As you know, right, Chris and CC are legends in our department. They always do an extremely good job with these things. And I think that study abroad over the summer with our department is a great way to get courses. It's a great way to explore different parts of the world. And so highly recommend checking out this information session. You can see the location is Fred Brooks 141. So make sure to, it's right after class. You have nothing to do, feel free to head on over there. All right, so with that, that is done. That is completing kind of our more lengthy announcements for today. We're going to be finishing up our design module. So we're going to be talking about this idea of inclusive design today. There's 2 main components of this lecture that are related to two different concepts, but I think that ultimately these are extremely important concepts that ultimately play a very big role in thinking about design regarding our larger scale applications, not only ones that you may work on, but definitely in industry. If you ever go work in the real world, this is something that's extremely important to these companies, right? So I want to start off with this kind of note, right? It may be slightly more obvious here, right? Everyone in this classroom, if you're understanding what I'm saying right now, right? You're familiar with English and you speak English mainly. That is how we are delivering this class, and your assignments, for example, the websites you'll be making are in English. All the text on there is English. Except really, only around 20% of the world is able to understand English, right? The population. There's a very large majority of the entire world population who would not be able to read English, or read, if you presented, for example, content in English on your website, it would be inaccessible to them. Right, so again, right? To the 80% of the world, your website would be incomprehensible. And by limiting your website to English only, right, you end up losing a very large part or a very large majority of what you could have in terms of a global audience. In addition, there is another interesting kind of component to this, which is the idea that content on your site may also be skewed to people from certain regions, right? So you can imagine, for example, if our website is English, let's say that we are building a recipe app. Some of you have been kind of doing that for your final projects or working on that idea. If your website is mostly written in English and English speakers are the ones who are using the site, well, the content that they're also going to post, right, may end up being skewed toward the geography and where the people are actually located. So there may be, for example, in recipes, a lot of other unique or interesting recipes from around the world that the people who are making those things would love to share those recipes. They're unable to on your website because they're unable to read the actual content on the website and not be able to interact with it, right? So even though we may allow everybody or anyone to access our website and to post something, ultimately the content that ends up actually on that page might be skewed if the content language that we're targeting is more narrowly scoped, right? And there's another note here, right, that browsers are getting a little bit better at live translation. You've probably, if you've ever been on a site that is in a foreign language, Safari or Chrome may try to translate it for you dynamically. In fact, these days with more also the large language model technology, this may get better. However, there are still many issues with this. If you try to go on a lot of websites and try to translate things, you may have a lot of issues. In particular, if a website is referencing items or people or products even, where their names are special names that are made up in whatever language that they are writing, right, that is not something that's going to easily translate through a translator, right? If it's something that's not just a word that is part of the common vocabulary, right? People's names might accidentally be translated as text instead of actually staying as just a name. And so you may have issues. Users who may go to your website and try to use one of these live translation tools may still have a hard time with actually making sense of the content on your page. And in addition, right, the search engine optimization that is done, that we have been talking about, especially with the more technical concepts like server-side rendering, right? Well, if your content is in a different language, it will not rank well on the search engine optimization or be bad for SEO in countries that do not use the language that you're targeting. So for example, if I write a website in English, maybe it has very good SEO in English-speaking countries, but if we try to load it maybe in France, right, it's going to ultimately rank other websites over yours because you're not, your content is only really targeted to one language. And so the question is, we've been talking about writing content on our website. We've used markup like HTML. We've been using React and all these components where we just type in text, right? Let's say inside of a paragraph, we type in our text in there. How in the world would we actually go about kind of making our website be available to people who speak different languages? And so this entire process of essentially tailoring different features of your apps to various languages or geographic regions is called localization, right? You can kind of localize, right, to make it more specific to a specific place. And so that's where the word localization comes from. And in the software engineering world, you'll often see internationalization as the term that is used. And oftentimes, you'll see it abbreviated as this, I-18N, like so, right? So I-18N is the abbreviation for this. You'll see it in a lot of places. In fact, if you go on the next documentation, you'll see something about this in various programming frameworks, software engineering frameworks. We'll talk about this because it's such an important part for large companies and large projects that target multiple different regions. There are a few things that are important to consider, right, to properly internationalize an application. For example, language translation, which we're going to be talking about. Another very interesting one, which we'll get to in a bit, is UI considerations, where actually the UI layout may change a little bit based on the region that you're in. We'll talk about why or how that might end up happening, and then other things as well. Any questions so far about kind of the core idea of what we're trying to do here? Great. So to continue on, when we talk about this idea of localization, we also need to kind of contextualize what a locale is. You'll see this word a lot as well. And all a locale is just a set of parameters that is essentially defining the region or the language that the user is in, or that the user maybe speaks. So for example, locales are used mainly to determine where a user is accessing a site from, maybe what region of the world, what country, but also what language they're trying to access for a particular page, right? So for example, in various countries, you may have people who speak also multiple languages. And so that's why just a country may not be sufficient enough. We need to go and we need to have both of those pieces of information, the language and also the location, right? So what ends up happening actually is the router and every time we make a network request to a server for a resource, this locale will also be provided along with that request. And so we're then on the server side, when we are going to actually generate content for the user to see, which we do, right, typically with the websites that we have been developing, well, we are able to now take advantage of this information and change the content to better fit the locale of the user. And all the locale is typically represented as is just represented as a string. You may have seen something like this before, EN, right, -US. This is English, but American English, right, United States. You have, for example, EN in GB, Great Britain, so English in the United Kingdom. This is an example where you'll have kind of two of the same language, but from a different region. And then, for example, here we have DE for German and Germany. So your locale is represented kind of as just a plain string. Any questions with this? All right. So to perform internationalization kind of in your project, you will essentially need to actually, we want to think about how do we actually map the text that's on our screen to a specific locale, right? Because we ultimately, if, for example, we're trying to load a page if we're trying to load something in English, we want to display English text. If we load something, for example, in Chinese or Mandarin, right, we have some text here that we want to display instead. And so what actually happens here is we need to create this thing called locale files. And locale files are essentially just key value pairs, where we take all of the strings in our project and we assign them some sort of key to represent what that particular string is. So for example, if we have a paragraph on our website that is a greeting, well, we're going to take that text and move it out, assign a key to it, like so, for example, greeting, and then we'll have different files for different locales. So you can see here we have a JSON file for English, which has a key, and then we have the actual string that's associated with that string's key. And then here we have one for Chinese as well. We have greeting, and then we have text associated with it. And what ends up happening then is using some sort of package, which we can use with Next.js, but also even in other frameworks as well. This is the same type of idea. We will then, instead of just typing in the string directly into your HTML or into your markup, you're instead going to use some sort of internationalization utility. So for example, in Next.js, there's this use translation hook that we can install. It's a third-party package. We then supply the name of the locale file. So you'll see in both cases we have common.json and then common.json for both English and Chinese. And then here, all we have to do is, instead of writing hello world in this tag, we will write t, right, which is our translation utility, and then just pass in the key of the text that we would want to put here. So what we're saying is that in this particular header, we're going to have this greeting text displayed to the user. Now, what is actually going to be displayed is going to be determined based on the locale of the user. So if they are trying to load the website in English and they're from the US, well, we're going to get hello world printed out there, right? If we're trying to load it, let's say, for Chinese, Chinese text will show up here. For French, right, French text would show up, etc. Any questions here so far? Right, so again, you can see for US users who are with the English locale, we will get hello world. right? And then maybe if we had users in China or any person as well who's maybe set their language to this, even if they're in a different country than China, this text would appear to them like this. And again, this is all happening because when we make that network request for the page, we can pass along the locale with it. And therefore, we would then be able to have this information when we're trying to determine what shows up on the page. Questions here? Right. So this is actually, believe it or not, and you might be questioning the fact that why there's got to be a better way than to have kind of these key value pairs. It seems a little bit odd. This is actually how it's done in even a lot of large projects, where you'll essentially have a very large, all of the text in your entire project will be put into these type of, they'll be given a key and they'll be put into one of these type of maps. And then for all the different languages, you'd have all the various translations. And again, the effort that goes into this, right? There's a lot of effort that goes in, and especially as you're trying to add more supported languages, there's a lot more maybe to manage, but also you have to imagine that these type of things are happening and are used by usually larger projects that would benefit from something like this, having more of a global audience and a global reach, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's very possible. It's very possible that it will. In fact, in general, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, even that we will talk about with accessibility as well, there's a lot of things now on the pre-processing side that different services may be able to perform for us. Browsers, right, are getting better at doing translation. I can imagine many years down the road with the improved technology that we have, right? Google Translate keeps getting better, and there's LLMs now that it could get better, and we can save ourselves a lot of this. A lot of times, though, again, is that there's some cases where it is very important that we specify these things ourselves, where we want to make sure that it is accurate and that we can verify it. And so that's why we would probably, at least for the time being, this would probably still be used. But yeah, great question. This is an area in particular, there's a lot of research going into accessibility right now and kind of this entire idea of localization. And there's a lot of innovation that's happening, especially as browsers and those type of software still develop. For Next.js in particular, there is a package called i18ed. So there's various packages. This is one of them. It's Next, i18 Next. It's based off of a React-based internationalization framework. And this is kind of what I had demoed a little bit on the slide. So you can see here, they have some information about setup, right? So you have a public folder, which you probably haven't opened. You've seen it in your Next.js project, but you can put your locales in the public folder. And so you have kind of for all the different languages, you'd have a JSON file. And then there's some setup that you'd have to perform. And then once you've completed the setup, using translation is pretty easy. You just have to use whatever hook they provide, pass in the key of the string that you're trying to access, and then what is displayed on the page will be in the correct language. Right? One of the great things with this particular package is, remember, with server-side rendering, right? You may be thinking that, well, it is probably important for SEO purposes that this text is generated right before it gets to the client. That is the entire purpose of server-side rendering. Well, this is also done and can be done using server-side rendering. In fact, Next.js will try its best, especially if you configure this correctly with the configuration above, including this function that is a special Next.js function we haven't talked about, right? Get static props. You notice it's similar to the get server-side props type of thing that we talked about for server-side data fetching. But using this configuration, you are able to get it such that the translated version is correctly given as the output of server-side rendering. So we still have all of the great benefits that we would get with our architecture, right? An SPA with server-side rendering, even with adding stuff like translation. And this is all possible again because, right, you have the request to the server contains the locale. So the server knows when the user requests for the site, what language or what region they're in, and it can then generate the correct page based off of that information. If you go to the Next.js documentation, so next.js.org, and go to docs, you'll also see, I believe, down here somewhere, and maybe I'll have to search for it. It's under, I may have to search, yeah, I may have to search Next.js I18N. There we go, guides, internationalization. This is what I was looking for, right? So you can see that there's a lot of other ways and a lot of other packages to do it, but a lot of the core concepts are still the same, where you'd want to have some sort of key value pair for all of your strings, and then you can use whatever package they recommend to get all of this working correctly. You can see that there's also some information about how these pages would actually load. So for example, you could try just going to the regular page. If you're in a certain region, it would load correctly. Or just to test to make sure that your localization is working, you can actually pass in the locale as a prefix to your path. So it would be something like, you know, finalproject.vercel.app/de for German/blog. And then that page would load with the German localization. Okay. And so you can set all of this up in Next.js, and there's a lot of resources here on how to do so. Information about, for example, search engine optimization, right? Language, for example, with HTML, and various other more advanced topics if you're interested in learning about this more. What I will note is that this is not just something that the web world uses, right? So for those of you who are in app team, you've used Swift. Right? Swift is a language that also does localization like this. You have some sort of configuration that has key value pairs. You will load in strings using that particular key, and your app then, depending on what, where your app is downloaded, will show the correct language. And that is how a lot of these apps you're able to download. For example, Amazon is Amazon app. You can download it in various countries, and it will show the correct language because it sets this up. Android apps as well in Kotlin. And in general, this is something that is widely used even in other types of programming languages and contexts as well. Any questions here? All right. So another thing that I want you to begin to think about is this idea that, well, with English, as well as a lot of the languages that we've already talked about today, they're written from left to right, correct? We read from the left-hand side, and then we continue rightward as we read text. However, not all languages actually end up functioning this way. Notably, for example, I think the most spoken out of all of these is Arabic, right? So for example, if we have some text like, right, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and then we have we have text in Arabic as well, you'll notice that Arabic goes from right to left, but English goes from left to right, as you can see. So this is another extremely interesting thing to think about when you are thinking about how do I lay out my website, right? Because if text is going from right to left, well, if we try to just put that in place of how we would typically, like if we just take a website layout that we have and just invert the text direction, right, that might not actually end up looking too good. So alignment, right, as you see here with text changes. And this has very major implications in UI design. And so what I would like you to do is to think for the next 3, 5, or 6 minutes, what other effects might text direction affect, or yeah, what UI considerations would text direction affect? You can think about it, go into apps if you have, or go into websites and try to conceptualize what would happen, and then we'll come together and talk about it. All right, everyone, spent some time talking about this. Do you have any thoughts on what implications right to left text would have? Everyone, it's time to get back together. Thank you. Any volunteers on how text direction might affect our UI design? Any thoughts? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like left to right, you can have a big file, like immediately hyperlink to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right to left, you need to like change your whole narrative story. Every like product manager.
Yeah.
That's one
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Especially, yeah, that's a perfect example, right? With the buy button, moving it, because again, with people follow, right? Their eyes go from right to left. And so you'd want to follow the same type of flow that you'd have with a typical left to right that we're used to. Well, for those who read text right to left, you want to try and preserve that. Any other thoughts? I think that is pretty comprehensive, but. Great. All right. So one note here that I have, I found this particular document one of the best. So if you were in Sam's class for Comp 433, again, you may have seen this, or if you're an app team, you've probably seen this, which is the Apple Human Interface Guidelines. We kind of talked a little bit about this in the design, our first UI UX design language lecture, but there is very interesting diagrams, I think, in this particular resource, which is very, very telling on how much actually text direction affects things, right? So for example, entire layout, right, of sites. So for example, if we have text and then we have images that are all left aligned, right? Typically on websites, we have things that are left aligned. Well, if we read right to left, everything would want to be right aligned instead to follow, because everyone's eyes are going to start on the right-hand side and then move leftward. And so this is very important, right? So again, here you can kind of see with our alignment with our text. Another thing is that if you are switching between languages, you want to make sure that you keep the alignment correct. There's other ones here, very fascinating, right? For example, ratings of stars. Instead of like 4-star ratings, instead of going 4 stars on the left-hand side and then 1 empty, with right to left on a right to left layout, you'd actually switch it. So you'd have, for example, if you're in with Arabic numerals, right? This is not 1.5 stars, this is 3.5 stars. We kind of start on the right-hand side and then we move to the left, which I think is pretty fascinating. Other things, controls, like volume controls. Instead, how we typically, right, off no volume is left, and when we slide right for max volume, well, on layouts with right to left, it's going to be the opposite, where the left-hand side is actually max, and then the right-hand side is minimum, right? So this is another case where this language consideration ends up changing our UI. Images as well. So images are one, right? They put in here just to be sure. Don't flip images. So things like the globe, you know, images still keep the right orientation. Interface icons. So certain icons, for example, with the battery icon ends up flipping, or the kind of our writing icon. So Apple has a right to left version of the icon that you can use if you're working with that, or bullet points, right? The bullet points are on the right-hand side. And various other things. So universal, right? Logos are not flipped. Things like check marks are not flipped because those are universal controls. So in general, right, I think that some of the most fascinating, especially with things like controls, this is something that you wouldn't necessarily consider. But if you're working on layouts where you need to support right to left text, all of this becomes extremely, extremely important. The good news is that there are some utilities that help us with things like this. So in particular, Tailwind has Tailwind RTL, I believe. Right, so I should have found the direct link to it because it's not here. But Tailwind does have right to left support as well. So there are certain modifiers that you can add in. For example, styles when right to left is active. This is, of course, the AI overview, so this might not be fully correct on the latest version of Tailwind. But you do have these type of modifiers as well. And so in web design, you can use the direction. This direction is supplied along with the HTML. Just like locale, you may have a direction then that is also supplied, and then you can support whatever direction is given. And again, on mobile devices, it's also pretty easy because a lot of these tools end up or a lot of the kind of UI frameworks in a lot of mobile devices will just automatically move things over if you design according to their specifications. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. And I think maybe if you're ever thinking about this more, you can try and load up examples or you can look up like screenshots of how apps look, for example, in Arabic, and it's a very fascinating thing to explore. So again, kind of as I was talking about with the one question that we had, right, localization is a pretty hard task because if we want to support a large variety of languages, well, we need to keep track of all of these languages, what the correct translation is supposed to be. You may have people dedicated to this, like if they're people who are translators or people who are multilingual, they might help with this. And so it is, though, very important in larger companies to do something like this and to have a good localization. Apple, for example, Microsoft, Amazon, Google will have dedicated teams that are all working on localization. And in a lot of also companies, right, as they're expanding to new markets, localization is something that's very, very important. And so we do not necessarily, this is not something that's typically covered, but it's something in this that's related, I think, really well to web programming and design. It's something that I think it's good to at least be aware of. In the future, even if someone asks, or if it's like in a job description, they talk about localization, now you know at least what that is referring to. I will note here that, of course, I do not expect you to localize your app for the final project, so that's given. Just think that it's important to know. And again, you'll probably see this again, especially as you progress working on software. Right? Whoops. And so again, the key principles of design here, we have talked about these 4 throughout the last many lectures, right? Simplicity, consistency, user centricity. What we kind of talked about today with localization falls a lot more in the user centricity section, right? Knowing the users and what their requirements are, what languages they may offer, who is using our app, et cetera. And then finally, the last thing that we have not necessarily covered yet, but still extremely, extremely important, is this idea of accessibility, right? Considering how what we consider, again, non-traditional users, how they actually interact with our apps. Right? So with kind of diving more into this, as we have already talked about, is that many people, right, interact with our websites. They may have some sort of impairment, either sensory or motor impairment, right? So sensory, eyesight, for example, either colorblindness, for example, is a mild case. You may have blindness, right? You may have hearing, right? Hearing loss or deafness, right? Motor control, hand movement, for example. You may not be able, right? A lot of apps you have to use a mouse, right, to explore and click around, and maybe people are unable to do so. And so we need to ensure that these users, which actually make up a pretty sizable chunk, right, of the total users that we could have, are still able to use our sites as well. And so there are many cases where users with such impairments may use various browser tools. There are things such as what we call screen readers, where essentially the browser or maybe some third-party software will actually read the content out to the user as they are interacting. So for example, if they have a visual impairment, they can still hear, right, the content of the site. And for example, there's other tools as well that you can use and hook up to for navigation, et cetera. And all of this helps them interact with your website. Right? But in order to kind of help out these browser tools, especially things like screen readers, right, screen readers need to be able to kind of get a general sense of the layout, of the hierarchy of the site, the content that's provided. And so it's important that we as developers kind of help the browser tools and help these tools out while they're trying to make the site accessible. And so there are a few things here that can help. One is that, right, browsers can actually use HTML tags to kind of determine the type of content that is actually available on the page. So for example, I think a very common one is with buttons, right? So a button is just, again, something that you click on and then it performs some sort of action. And if you are kind of aware with how, if you've come across this already with React, is this idea that, well, we could just have a div and then supply an on-click handler to it, and then it behaves like a button. Right? So we can essentially use paragraphs or divs or various other elements in the same way that we would typically interact with a button with, right? Have some sort of action. Maybe when you hover it, the mouse changes, right, from an arrow to kind of a pointer, indicating this is something that's clickable. And so for you, as someone who is using the site, well, that looks like a button, and and you're able to interact with it. However, screen readers do not know that that is actually a button, right? Because they're reading through, imagine, they're just reading through the HTML, the text that's provided. They see that it's a div. They don't know if that div is a layout, right, container that you're just putting a bunch of things in, if there's some special, if there's something special about it, and they don't actually know whether or not it is a button. And so there's various types of HTML tags that we can use that essentially behave a lot like divs. For example, some of these other ones like headers and footers, aside and nav, et cetera, that are functionally, from a layout perspective, the same as something like a div, except they provide some sort of semantic meaning for a, for example, screen reader. So this is what's known as semantic HTML. So instead of just using, let's say, 20 divs in your project, you may instead want to use things like button, nav, header, footer, aside, et cetera. What this actually looks like, and I know that the text here may be a little bit small, so if you have it open, you'll be able to see. But I'll try and write it here on the side, right? So at the top here, for our header section, we use the header tag, which you can see. So instead of a div containing the items for our header, we will use the HTML element that's called header to actually contain this information. Then we have another one here called nav, and nav is used for kind of navigation controls. So you can remember at the top of a lot of websites, you usually have some sort of menu at the top that you can physically click on different things to switch pages. And so that might be navigation related. And then we have in here as well, which I'll point to, we have main, which is and contains all of the actual site content. So this is like the main body of your page. Then you also have articles and asides, which are interesting. So article might contain like actual like the raw content. Our aside might be related content or things that are not necessarily important to the, well, they're important, but they're less so, right, in a hierarchical structure, less provenance. And then we have footer down here. And so even though we can make this exact same page using just divs, and everything could be a div, and it would look probably the exact same, for a screen reader, seeing exactly, OK, what is the header? What is navigation? What is the main content? What is the footer? It then is able, when actually performing these different operations and reading out the content, it will be able to say, OK, well, I will go to the main section and start reading in there. Or I can kind of use the context of how this site is structured. I'm given, the screen reader is given information about the structure. It's not just a bunch of nested divs. And that ultimately helps with it being able to read the screen more correctly. And so this is something that, again, it's a very useful thing. It's a very useful thing to know. And there's a lot of resources on semantic HTML. So if you go to, for example, just search up semantic HTML, I believe that there's a document. Right, so HTML semantic elements on W3 Schools. I'm sure some of you have been on the site at some point. It's pretty great for resources regarding HTML, right? And you can see, right, things like div and span. They don't tell you anything about the content, but image, table, article, right, various things. For example, figures we didn't necessarily talk about, right? Figure captions, summaries. All of these are various tags and elements that you can include that provide more information to screen readers and provide for better accessibility. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yep. So these are DOM elements. So the way it would look like, unfortunately, my tablet is not connected, but you'd have kind of the same type of, so HTML. Sorry, this will be a little bit difficult here. HTML. And then you'd have body. And then, yeah, you'd have header as an item. And then under header, you'd have other items like so. So it is just an element on the DOM tree. Yeah. Very good question. Section is another big one, which I don't think I may have not mentioned. So for example, if your content has multiple, maybe kind of subsections within it, using section is great because then you're able to click around and navigate. So like you can see here, right, worldwide fund for nature, and then panda symbol. These are two different sections in this example. Any other questions regarding semantic HTML? All right. Perfect. Another thing here, which is very useful, are this idea of what we call alt properties or ARIA properties, as you may have seen this at some point, especially if you're using certain Next.js, I think like, for example, images in Next.js, you actually may have gotten a alert telling you to put something like an alt text. So sometimes the tools that we have installed, it may have prompted you to do this already. But the idea is that, for example, visual information. If you have a website with an image on it, well, the screen reader is not going to be able to, at least right now, maybe in the future, if it becomes practical to use image recognition and kind of more of the AI technology now that we have, it might be able to do this. But for the largest time, right, the screen reader is not going to be able to look at an image and tell what it is and give a proper description of it. And so it might just say something out loud like image, right? Image on the page. That's all it has. Well, in the case that a screen reader is reading your image, you may want to provide this, what we call alt text or ALT, which is basically specifying that if the image is either not loaded for whatever reason, we can just display this text, or if a screen reader is reading this image, we can then say this string instead of just saying that there's just an image and providing no information. So for example, if I have a picture of maybe a screenshot, let's say I'm giving you some instructions on how to deploy your website, right, to like Supabase, for example, or sorry, Vercel, or setting up Supabase, and I provide a screenshot on how to do that. Well, in my alt text for one of those, I might say that this is, right, vercel.com on this tab, this information, something like that, right? Give some information about the image. Or if there's like a scene, you know, in, let's say, in a, I don't know, in nature, they're saying that, you know, you can see there is this type of bird, right, in this type of forest or whatever, right? These are things that you can provide so that screen readers are still able to then convey the same type of information to the user. And there's also other elements as well that may have these ARIA properties, which are also the same thing. ARIA is kind of a web standard that screen readers are often use. And so providing some values for these properties allow these screen readers to be able to provide that information to whoever's needing to use them. For example, ARIA properties, I think W3 would have one as well, although I'm not seeing, there we go. I'll just click on Mozilla is another one, right? So you can see there's various different, maybe I have to click on one of these, right? There's different roles, for example, you can see. So ARIA, you may have a role of what a specific piece of content actually is. You may have also information about what to say. So for example, if there's an interactive element, like a slider, you might want to provide more information about, for example, the start range, the end range, the location, how to actually interact with it, those type of things as well. Any questions with any of that? All right. So another question that you may have thought about is, okay, we've talked a little bit about how to make sites a bit more accessible using semantic HTML, using properties like alt properties and ARIA properties. But how can is there any way to be able to kind of look at a site that we have and determine, do we have any glaring accessibility issues that might need to be fixed, right? Kind of some program or some process that can look at our website, run through it, and then kind of flag these issues. And there actually is, and it's called Lighthouse. So Lighthouse is a tool that performs a lot of diagnostic metrics on our website and assigns essentially our website and these different parts, these different metrics with some sort of score. So some metrics that we might look at are performance, best practices, SEO, and also accessibility, as we are talking about. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do this. So this is built into Chrome and the Chrome Developer Tools Kit. So if you go to Chrome, which I have here, and I've opened up, let's say just open up the CSXL website here. This is the homepage for the Excel. Right? How do I access the Lighthouse report? So you will right-click and go to your same inspector tools like you have before. Right? You can see we have our HTML and kind of the same. We had that responsive mode that we used last time. It is this item right here at the end. So there's an item that says Lighthouse under toolbar. And if you press that, you'll see that we have some information about generating a Lighthouse report. You have You can choose what device you want to run the report with. I'm just going to use the default here for mobile, pretend we're on a mobile device. And we'll also check mark all of these categories. So it is going to analyze performance, accessibility, best practices, as well as SEO. And so if I press on Analyze, you'll see that it's going to run through, it's going to audit now our website. And it's going to compute scores here. And you can see we have now 4 different metrics. So this is for the homepage of the SysExcel website, right? You'll notice best practices is very good, but we have some concerns with SEO, accessibility, and performance. And in fact, one of the interesting things with this is we can connect all the way back to our original talk about web app architectures, right? The Excel website is a fully SPA website without server-side rendering. So that's why when you remember, we were talking about the fact that SSR helps us have better SEO. A plain SPA does not have good SEO because of, we're just getting a blank page essentially from the server. So you can see here, SEO, our score is hurt. And so if we compare this, if we were to rebuild the site with server-side rendering, for example, that score would be higher. But accessibility, I'll click on this. And it gives you a lot of information. So you can see here ARIA, right? It says here roles are not contained by their required parent element. So this is just giving some indication that for screen readers or assistive technology, there is a particular maybe ARIA tag that we're missing. Images, missing alternative text, right? So I know on the home page there's an image, right, of the Excel. That image probably does not have any alt text associated with it. And so therefore, it's giving us a warning. And you can actually click on this, and it will tell you, you can see exactly, here is our image, right? So this is the image right on our home page. We have the entire Excel there. And you'll notice that it's saying this image failed. It does not have any alternative text. You should add it. And that deducted from our score. And so to improve our accessibility, we could add some alternative text here. And there's also other things. For example, it's saying here navigation. There are opportunities to improve keyboard navigation, right? So in this currently on the Excel site, I can't just navigate around using my arrow keys on my keyboard. So it's going to tell me that that might be a concern as well. There's also other things here that I think are pretty useful, right? So SEO, for example, right? So you can see there's some details about SEO, right? Document does not have a description on it. There's images. You notice that alt text actually also affects not only just accessibility, but also SEO, right? Because that's information that the search engine can use to index a site. So it's useful to have, right? Other things, there's, to appear in search results, right? There's some issues with missing certain files. We have past audits. Performance is another great thing. And with performance, you can actually click on, they have this 53 here. I can click on it, and you actually have more values that are associated with this. And you'll notice, for example, one, you'll probably remember that we talked about, right? First contentful paint. Remember that kind of metric from our data loading. You can see it's pretty bad here. In fact, it's saying it's saying, according to this, 22.6 seconds. Of course, it's running this on purposely on a slower device. But again, we are using an entirely client-side based. We're using an SPA that's client-side loaded, and we're using client-side data loading. And so we are going to have major impacts on our performance in these categories. And so this is another great thing to look at as you're developing if you want to make a site have better performance, better SEO, better accessibility, et cetera. I know it's not a direct comparison because the course website is a lot more, there's a lot less content on here, but I'll run it here as well. So you can go to Lighthouse and analyze. And you'll see it's going to go through the same type of process, loading the page, gathering information. And there we go. We have better metrics, still not perfect, right? There's still some things missing. You'll notice, though, that because we are using SSR here, things like performance, we have a lot better metrics. Of course, there's not a tremendous amount of data loading that's happening here anyway. So it's not like we have a crazy amount of loading state, but things like SEO and performance are better with Next.js and server-side rendering, right? So accessibility, for example, you can see, in fact, look, it's telling me there's an issue with contrast color contrast. Remember, that's something I was talking about of bad color contrast can be hard to see. And it's telling me exactly where that is. So it's telling me that this due tonight, so where on the page I have this part here, this kind of reddish text does not have sufficient contrast against the white for accessibility purposes. And so I get that warning, right? And so these are all things that, again, as you're developing your site, you can look at for accessibility purposes. Right. OK, so the next thing here, let me go back to my slides, is there's a rectangle on top of this. Let me delete that. So with your turn, with your group, so I'd like you to try to go to a website that you frequently visit, run the Lighthouse report on it, and you will then take a screenshot of that and submit it to Gradescope to show that you're able to successfully run the Lighthouse report on a website. So spend 5-ish minutes on this. If you have any questions, TAs will be walking around to help with that. There are a lot of cases where there are websites that you'd expect to have kind of poor performance, poor accessibility SEO to actually have good accessibility, and vice versa. Same with performance as well. There's actually one website, if I'm able to find it, maybe I'll post it, that is, I believe, like a tool inventory website, which is not necessarily something that you'd expect to have extremely, but it is a significantly over-engineered website where pretty much every single filter and page change that you do is like nearly instantly loaded due to how it is architected, which is very fascinating. I'll see if I can link it later. But these are, using these type of scores and these reports is very useful to determine kind of how, as you're developing your website, how it's doing. And so because of that, we will also be looking at the Lighthouse score. This is something that is it's in the rubric. It's already been in there for the final project. You'll find that because you're using ShadCN and because you're using SSR, accessibility and SEO will typically always be pretty good just as a baseline. Because ShadCN is accessible by default. It has a lot of these properties already set up for you. And so we will be looking at the Lighthouse report for your website in these two categories. And even though you may think that 90% seems very high, you'll find that as long as you're kind of following the convention for the most part, you'll probably get these. In addition, remember that there's a to-do list, right? So if your score is low, it tells you exactly what to fix. And so you can go in and fix those, and then you'll have a pretty good accessibility score. So this is something that is a best practice. If you're working on websites in real world, you want to make sure that your SEO in particular, your accessibility are good. And so we're going to be checking for that in the final, all the way at the end. So you don't have to worry about it necessarily for sprint one. This is like the final submission. We'll run the Lighthouse report on your site. Any questions here? All right, so the last thing I want to note here is that this entire idea of inclusive design, which incorporates things like accessibility, like internationalization, localization, and various other things, this is a very big push right now. A lot of computer science education related faculty in various colleges to begin to talk about this in the classroom. There is a lot of big impact that worrying about these type of things in both design aspect and also the engineering aspect that, again, very big impact, both societal impact as well as, if you're even a business impact, if you think about, who you're able to kind of get your site and get your tools kind of out there and who's able to use them, right? So in Comp 426, we're a class that we're teaching, right, web programming. We're teaching how to build web applications. And so this has, in general, not only just this lecture, but the entire design module, we had a great opportunity to talk about this, something that is not necessarily maybe discussed in a lot of classes you have had. However, these ideas transcend just web programming, goes into app development. It goes into any other type of field you're working on. Robotics, for example, there's a lot of applications there. Visualization, data science, data engineering, there's a lot of these same principles apply. And so if you're interested, again, I highly recommend looking into other resources, online, looking into other courses, maybe Chris Jordan's course over the summer, maybe courses taught on HCI in this department. I know that typically, I believe it's Danielle Zafer teaches a lot of these courses, information visualization, visualization design methods. These courses are all really related to this idea of design, UI, UX design, those type of things. All right, so that is all I have for today. Have a good rest of your weekend. Make sure to get in your submission for F01, and we'll see you all tomorrow for presentations.